Okay, all right. Shikmaitski, ain't nashwinik Okay. Shikmaitski, ain't nashwinik twapit, ku Pashinwiki, Patricia Whitefoot, Kutlaninam Ashanisha, the National Indian Women's Resource Center Conference. I greeted you in our language of the Yakama Nation, where I'm from in White Swan, Washington. And I also just shared my Indian name, Atwapit, as well as my English name, Patricia Whitefoot, and said greetings to all of you. I'm happy to be here with you all today to share my story with you. My story is going to focus on the statement that I prepared and made before the Washington State Legislature on Senate House Bill 2951 on the topic of reporting and identifying missing Native women. And so it was important to me because the majority of the legislators were non-Native. As a matter of fact, they were all non-Native. And so every step of the process, for me, it was an educational process to also educate the non-Native people who live predominantly in Eastern Washington. I come from a very rural, remote, isolated community. And I know, having worked in state government in Olympia for a period of years as the state director of Indian education, I knew what the conversations were like. Conversations never did include Eastern or Central Washington. It was always about the Seattle or Tacoma area, all up and down the I-5 corridor from Canada on down to Portland. And so I was aware of that and recognized the need to be able to share from my heart, the role that I had on this particular topic. And so I began by just sharing that my family was raised and lived in the community of Medicine Valley, which is located on the western slopes of the Cascade Mountains in south central Washington state on the Yakama Reservation. My parents, my siblings, they all enjoyed a very close family relationship with one another, as well as with my grandparents, and also living with some of the elders of our community. This homeland is important to me, as it was where my grandparents lived and carried out our way of life, as our ancestors did. In carrying out our way of life, we were hunters, subsistence fishing people, and food gatherers of the indigenous foods and medicines that come from our land. And the nearby mountains and the rivers and natural resources are abundant and continue to be abundant and provide for our survival and our way of life. On February 12, 2018, I had prepared and provided a written statement to share before the Washington State Legislature on this legislation. However, as I considered this legislation, I thought about my family, of course, my siblings, and our shared history of our community of White Swan and the Yakama Reservation, as well as the Northwest area, as I had begun to learn more about my family ancestry and my history, which comes from the Northwest area, where we had lived communally among our tribes and with what the Creator provided for us in the land, resources, the ceremonies, the rituals, the language, the stories, everything that I had been raised with. And I was raised by my maternal grandparents, my grandmother and grandfather. At the same time, as I was preparing for the legislation, I was also reminded of the deliberative actions of the settler colonization of the federal government and organized religion to eliminate Native people from our homelands. In the 1950s, as a young child, I had witnessed my grandmother and her great-great-aunt undergo excruciating pain as family graves were removed to make way for electricity for the city of Tacoma. Also, early in my life, my family had experienced foster care, living in foster homes, and also being placed in the Yakama Indian Christian Mission in the community where I live today in White Swan. In addition to that, my grandmother had also been in the Fort Simcoe boarding school. And today, as I think about that, and it was just within the past few months that I realized that the place where I live today, I live right in the middle of these two institutions that really impacted my life. I live about 2 miles from Fort Simcoe, which is to the west of me, and 2 miles to the east of me is the White Swan Indian Christian Mission. So that realization just just showed itself just recently. So for me, being at the mission, just being away from home and separated from family caused great anxiety, caused great pain, and of course, long periods of loneliness for myself. And something I'm sure that not only did I experience, but also other family members experienced as well, because there were other family members, but also other tribal members that were at this mission. The role of organized religion to immerse us in our informal education and to rid us of our Indianness was a form of abuse, indoctrination, and manipulation of who we are as Indian people. Throughout this time, as a young child, I experienced racism and discrimination in the local schools and communities that I didn't quite comprehend as a young child, when we would be bused to different communities or we'd be bused to the schools. And so we were, made fun of because we were the mission kids. In the summer months, my sisters and I and my family, of course, would be able to return home to our grandparents, where we were nurtured as children, and we were also trained and educated in the ways of who we are as young Yakima children. In addition to that, with World War II over, wartime stresses impacted our family, and I had uncles who were in the war as well. And so those stresses impacted our family, and our way of life began to erode by failed government policies, the effects of alcoholism, and family separation. In the fall of 1986, as a result of all of this, well, I can't say it was as a result of that, but just this kind of, I think this kind of stresses and trauma impacted my entire community, because it was not unusual for me when I was going through high school that I was going to lose family members or friends who were my age who did not make it to graduation because of the high rate of death and alcoholism in our community. In the fall of 1986, my younger sister, Daisy Mae Heath Tallman, didn't return home for several days. Since she had occasionally traveled to visit with family members on the Yakima Reservation or in Warm Springs, Oregon, on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation, I thought she would eventually return home. It was just her way. She would go and visit with family members and stay with them. And because of this time of year, she could even be up in the mountains camping by herself and gathering our foods, or she could be down on the Columbia River as a young fisherwoman, fishing at the river and camping there. And so it was, like I said, it was not unusual for her to be gone for periods of time. And at the same time, there are other Yakima Indian women who were missing and or murdered. And finally, I came to the realization that she could be one of those individuals who's missing and murdered. And after a period of time, my another sister said, I think we need to report her as missing. And so my sister, a younger sister, went ahead and reported my sister as missing. Today, it's been over 30 years since she's been missing. And my family still wonders about her fate. And like other family members, I know this is long overdue because of the heightened awareness of what's been going on with missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. And so because of this heightened awareness, it brings it to the forefront every time. My sister was young, independent, and strong-willed. Her character was best demonstrated in her natural skills in basketball and softball, where she received numerous accolades and recognition as an all-star basketball player, most valuable player in the Northwest region. She was also known for her fierce determination and courage, especially in the face of adversarial situations. On many occasions, it wasn't unusual for her to aid family and friends who were being assaulted. She was a force herself to be reckoned with. She would go to the aid if people needed help. She was her nieces and nephews' greatest fan, and to the children, she was their greatest hero. As a sister, auntie, and a mother, she respected the vision of our ancestors and actively practiced our way of life by being a traditional food gatherer, a subsistent fishing woman, and held a high regard for the land we lived on and for our people. As I considered the intent of the legislation to report and identify missing Native women in our state, I appealed to the legislature to consider the impact of historical trauma of the many Native families who have not had resolution regarding the missing and murdered Native women in our community and also in the state. Rather than just focus on identifying them, it's also to recognize that when family members are murdered, that in some cases, several of them had been missing for a period of time before they were even located on our reservation. In the case of my younger sister, there has been little or no communication with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Yakama Nation Police, and the Federal Bureau of Indian Investigation. Further, during the Bush administration period, the U.S. Attorney General Gonzalez visited White Swan to address the community devastation, but there was never any follow-up regarding our loved ones. In the years since my sister has been missing, there has been no official reporting of any of these agencies. On 2 occasions, the FBI visited me personally at my work site in the public school where I work to take saliva samples. However, there has never been any follow-up or communication from them to this day. Due to the crisis faced in White Swan today, and today the governor of our state is in our community to address community violence, and family members have been calling me about this meeting that is going on right now with our government. Because of the unchecked crime and violence, a community meeting was held this past winter. During the meeting, I publicly urged tribal officials to support Resolution 2 by Senator Steve Daines and John Tester of Montana to recognize the day of May 6th as a day of remembrance of the missing and murdered Native women. In response to my plea at the meeting, a former tribal official stated the demise of the missing and murdered Native women could be that of a serial killer. As the older sister, I'm simply seeking resolution and justice. I do understand the unresolved missing and murdered women issues face jurisdictional and legal complexities. However, dedicated resources are urgently essential for addressing this need. Similar to the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women's Act, there are limited protections for Native women. In addition, the Survive Act in the Senate includes 5% funding streamed for tribal governments out of the Crime Victims Fund. Further, Savannah's Act has been introduced in the Senate by Senator Heidi Heitkamp to address the missing and murdered Native women, with a similar bill introduced by Representative Norma Torres of California. During the week of February 12, 2018, the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs hosted a listening session on missing and murdered Native women and girls. While action will take time to realize for Indian country, it's important that Washington State and the congressional leaders continue moving forward. The fate of our loved ones must have meaning in their precious roles as sisters, as mothers, as aunties and grandmothers. As the legislature considered this long overdue legislation, I urge them to seriously consider the impact on our families with the following data that's been shared by the Resource Center. And I think it's important to continue calling out this data because it has an impact on us today, even while we're meeting here. More than 4 in 5 American Indian Alaska Native, 85.3%, have experienced violence in their lifetime, including myself. If I were to ask in this room, what would that data be in your life as well? 56.1 have experienced sexual violence. 66.4 have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner. As I read all of this to our state legislature, I began to realize that I fit into every category that was being listed in my testimony before the legislature. And the specific recommendations that I made to the legislature were to, first of all, be respectful and sensitive of our cultural protocols, particularly as it pertains to the fate of the missing and murdered Native women. For too long, our families have experienced grave violations and have not had closure in the unresolved issues and loss of our loved ones. Secondly, the fate of the missing and murdered Native women on the Yakima Reservation is long overdue. I urge the legislature to provide dedicated resources to undertake the accounting of the missing and murdered Native women. Third, expand the goal to be inclusive of missing and murdered Native women and men. In many cases, murdered women and families have not secured resolution in a sense of safety, especially when the family members had been missing for a period of time. And in my case, I have not felt safe in my community since that time. Even though it's been 30 years, you still don't have a sense of safety and resolution. Fourth, while I plotted the goal to work with the Washington State Patrol and the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs, these agencies are subject to male privilege and lack Native women leadership. I urge the legislature to also utilize the critical expertise of Native women and through an advisory committee or a nonprofit Native organization comprised of Native women leadership. Finally, I urge the legislature to consult with the University of Washington's Indigenous Wellness Research Institute. The Institute has expertise and Native women who are engaged in creating partnerships with our tribes and our communities in addressing the impact of historical trauma and well-being. The purpose of my statement was to honor and give voice to the beautiful life of my sister. In the many missing and murdered sisters on our reservation, and also throughout Indian country. To me, it's critical that the epidemic of violence, that we all work in curtailing this epidemic of violence, that we address it at every level in order to prevent these atrocities so the legacy doesn't become a standard for us. And as a grandmother today, that's what I want to overcome. So that legacy doesn't live on, in our children and our grandchildren. Today I pray for healing and some small degree of reconciliation among the families as we strive to follow our ancestral ways and follow in their footsteps in seeking resolution and healing for our communities. And one way that some sisters and I at our Longhouse are doing that is by working with our young people. And as an educator, for me, that's natural to be able to do. And so what we're doing with our young Longhouse girls is we're helping to bring back our traditional ways of being by teaching them our traditional social dances. Rather than focusing on the powwows, we're teaching them our traditional social dances and songs and rituals that go along with them. And several years ago, about 7 years ago, the families decided that they also wanted to recognize, the fact that my sister had been missing, and they decided to start wearing red wing dresses. We make wing dresses for our girls with various types of colors. We're faced, when you think about the health conditions of our community, we also have to take a look at the health disparities. We have not only the missing and murdered Native women, we also face health conditions where we have a high rate of diabetes, a high rate of cardiovascular disease. In our county, it's unfortunate that we have the highest rate of chlamydia in our communities as well. It's sad to say that, but it's something that I share with our students. It's important that we share these kinds of statistics with our young people so that they know as well, and that we also confront these health disparities in our community. And that's what we do with our young girls. And so what I would like to do is just share one of the songs that I sing with our young girls, and there's a dance that goes with it, and I'll share the interpretation as I close here. But I would also just like to ask that we not record this one because it's, for me, it's sacred and something that we're teaching our girls and teaching them to sing, and they are also singing it too. And the interpretation of the song, and you'll hear it, it's the butterfly dance. And the story is that that butterfly man had been traveling the world, and as he traveled the world, he was walking with a burden on his back. And if you think about the moth, and as they prepare, they have the backs that they carry. And the butterfly man had traveled the world. He traveled for a period of time with his wife, and as he and his wife traveled, his wife had passed on, and so because of he mourned for her love and her life, he traveled around the world for a year. He traveled to the east, he traveled to the north, he traveled to the west, and he traveled to the south. And one day the Creator said, "Butterfly man, your wife is now gone, and you have to work towards seeking resolution and balance within your life. And with that, I'm going to rid you of the burden that you've been carrying." And as a result of that, the butterfly man turned into a beautiful butterfly. And with that, the young girls sing the song, but they also dance the song. And so when you stop to think about a butterfly, the girls are they're looking like the butterfly man, and so they're coming out, and they're in a big circle. They're coming out, and they have their hands down. And because they're coming out in pain and sorrow and pain that they're suffering from. And as we sing, we're going through, and they're coming out in mourning. And as the drum beats, I didn't bring a drum,